They have a hard core of at least 80 people who managed to avoid jail for 30 years. And they killed hundreds and hundreds, and they lost 11 people themselves. Now, once those people began to just put their minds to raising huge amounts of money, they're quite simply the equal in those terms of anybody else in the world, and in many points much more efficient and much more deadly.
International terrorism and organised crime go hand in glove. For nearly 40 years, the main paramilitary player in Ireland has been the Provisional IRA. Now, to run their war, they needed money, a lot of money, and most of it was dirty.
One of the seminal events that led to the creation of the Criminal Assets Bureau was the murder of Detective Garda Jerry McCabe in June 1996. Jerry McCabe was ambushed by volunteers of the Munster Brigade of the Provisional IRA, who set out to rob a post office van in Adair, County Limerick. The gang led by Kevin Walsh wanted old age pensioners' money in order to maintain their so-called war in Northern Ireland and to help fund Sinn Féin's vision of a socialist republic.
Well, in fairness to them, what they did was carry out this act, having been authorised by someone within the IRA.
The facts of the matter are that Jerry McCabe was working as a security officer of this state, defending the Constitution, standing by the Republic. And I wish to goodness that when people listen to certain propaganda emanating from the IRA and Sinn Féin, that they would remember that it's not the man who wraps the green flag around him who is the patriot. It is the man who stands by the flag. McCabe stood by the flag. Those who shot him denigrated it.
There is now a new kind of criminal, which once upon a time used to describe themselves as political activists. I'm talking about the people who murdered Jerry McCabe. With the peace process now in the north, with the new assembly up and running, many of those people who had no other trade, who robbed and stole for the IRA and for Sinn Féin as well as for themselves, have, to borrow a phrase, they haven't gone away, you know. And we have to look at what they're doing and how they're doing, and to realise that they will be as vociferous and as dangerous in protecting their little patch and their little hoard of ill-gotten wealth as anybody else.
In my period in justice in 86, 87, it was known and there was clear evidence of the fact that Sinn Féin, they were involved not only in paramilitary activity and, quasi-political activity, as they would have called it themselves, but also straightforward criminal activity. It was clear at that time that they were running drinking shops, that they were running various smuggling operations to make money, and that their methods were quite brutal.
The Provo War claimed thousands of lives in Ireland, north and south of the border. One legacy of that struggle was a multi-million-pound criminal empire that enabled Sinn Féin to become the richest party in the country. Another consequence was that murder, extortion, kidnapping, robbery and racketeering became part of our way of life.
The legacy of the Troubles, looking at it from a justice and crime point of view, has been the development of gun crime in Ireland, which was very rare before the Troubles. It led rapidly to a culture of bank robberies, which in turn familiarised the criminal class with the use of firearms. We're living with that. And in addition to that, of course, smuggling, which was always a problem between the Republic and Northern Ireland, became a more professionalised racket than it had been before then. It's not as big as the drug problem, but it is the second biggest problem the Criminal Assets Bureau have to deal with.
For years, the armed struggle to unite Ireland was waged on the back of a vast organised crime enterprise. Kidnapping, armed robbery, extortion, smuggling, and even licensing drug traffickers were all seen as a means to an end, to get money to fight the war.
Here we had a large organisation, paramilitary organisation, importing, let's be honest, when one looks at it, vast amounts of weaponry, providing safe houses, recruiting people, training people, because for every operation that had to be carried out, for every 5 at the coal-facing operations, you had to have at least 25 in the background. That all costs money. So, in essence, it was costing millions to run the military wing of the Republican movement, of the Provisional IRA at that particular time.
This is oil country, but it sure as hell ain't Texas. During the Provost's Long War, this part of the border in South Armagh became a key theatre of operations. And it wasn't just for gun and bomb attacks, but for criminal rackets. And the Provosts used those criminal rackets to fill their war chest. The Boreens and drumlins of South Armagh are deceptively peaceful. But the Provosts turned this pastoral landscape into a killing zone. This is where the so-called legitimate targets were bombed and sniped at. This is where the IRA slaughtered Protestants and tortured and executed their own. This is where the rule of law was replaced by the rule of the IRA Army Council. In this atmosphere of terror, the Republican movement perfected the methods of revolutionary fundraising. In bandit country, the Provisionals discovered that there were many ways to make a killing.
Over the 10 years that I was in the Criminal Assets Bureau and the experience of investigating matters along the borders of Armagh, Down, Louth and Monaghan, principally those counties, the principal activity, you can phrase it all in one word, is smuggling. For argument's sake, we'll take the product of petrol. If the price is exorbitant in the north of Ireland and they can buy it cheap in the south of Ireland, the Mr. Biggs will purchase large quantities of petrol. That petrol is then distributed to garages that are under the control of the smugglers in the north of Ireland. No VAT is paid, no tax whatsoever is paid, so that accumulates to a vast amount of profit that they can make.
The scale of the scam has made it impossible to do legitimate business. A number of multinational giants have pulled out of the border region, unable to compete with the diesel market rigged by oil smugglers. Moonshine alcohol, counterfeit consumer goods, and contraband cigarettes are all staples of the underground economy. In 2002, British Customs estimated that over £20 million a month was being lost on revenue on diesel sales alone. It's the same story with cigarettes.
Cigarettes are bought legitimately in the factory in Belfast, in Gallagher's. They're then exported out of Ireland to Rotterdam. They then do a route into Cyprus or Malta, and from there they go to America. They're all still in the same container. They're relabeled, and they eventually make their way back into Ireland via Rotterdam. They're then transported to the border and smuggled into the north and sold in shops and filling stations that are controlled then by subversives throughout the whole north of Ireland.
The Mr. Biggs behind the frauds on the frontier are the South Armagh Brigade of the Provisional IRA. South Armagh has been described as Sicily without the sun. For nearly 30 years, it's been the hub of terror and racketeering. One man has presided over all the murder and mayhem, Thomas Slab Murphy. All the dark rat runs that crisscross the Orchard County lead ultimately to a place called Hackball's Cross in County Louth. One man who has monitored the movements of Slab Murphy for many years is Kevin Sheehy, the former head of the RUC drug squad, who is also one of the RUC's leading investigators into paramilitary racketeering. Now, Sheehy was by no means a stereotypical RUC man. He was a Catholic, a vegetarian, and an ex-Antrim GAA footballer. In his time, he saw the border not only become a killing field, but a lucrative haven for illicit trade.
How important is Slab Murphy to the whole picture?
Well, Slab Murphy was an army counsel and was essential to the whole thing. There's this romantic notion of smuggling down along the border, and in the early 70s and through the 70s it was of the things like grain, of livestock, of machinery and of alcohol because of the differentials between north and south. In time, people like Slab Murphy realised how lucrative that business was, because he was a smuggler himself. He established, on behalf of the IRA, a set of rules of procedure where anyone involved in smuggling had to relate to him, pay tariffs, and could only do it in accordance with the rules of the IRA. South Armagh are a very independent group. They all know each other. They're all dedicated to each other. They're dedicated to the Republican cause. And Slab Murphy is the most influential figure in that whole area. No one smuggles anything down along the border without clearance of the IRA. And Slab Murphy is the IRA down there.
And that's happening today?
That's happening today and will happen for decades to come.
What value would you put on the smuggling along the border?
It's very difficult to put an exact figure, but over the decades, it's several hundred million. Much of that money, because of the commitment of the South Armagh people to the IRA cause, was not siphoned off. That was a major problem in loyalism. But those people down there were committed to the cause. Most of that money, in my view, has been invested in property, businesses to appear legitimate.
That dedication to the cause has earned Slab Murphy the public praise of Gerry Adams. The Sinn Féin president has described his friend Tom as a good Republican. But since 1996, the Criminal Assets Bureau has been very interested in how all the dirty money generated by Slab and his comrades has been laundered and legitimised. The border racketeers have been creaming it for years. Hundreds of millions of pounds have been washed and invested in ventures that are now kosher and respectable. Unlike their international freedom-fighting friends, the Provos didn't turn to Zurich or the Cayman Islands to wash their dirty money. They kept it nice and local in little places like this unremarkable Bureau de Change, which sat right on the border at Dramad, between County Louth and County Down.
There was information from a large number of sources that paramilitaries and wannabe paramilitaries were dealing heavily in criminal activity. They were dealing in oil smuggling backwards and forwards across the border. They were dealing in drugs, and they were dealing in racketeering. And information came from a number of sources that central to these activities was this bank in Dramad, an underground bank, as we would call it.
The principal controller of this business was a person by the name of Kieran Byrne. He had taken over the business from his father a couple of years prior, and he generated it into a huge turnover in the small number of years that he was controlling it.
Kieran Byrne's Bureau de Change first came to the attention of the police in 1998 following a Garda investigation into a Dublin drug gang. The file was passed to CAB, and they soon discovered that this little house on the border was a front for a vast underworld bank, used exclusively by organised crime and terrorists.
Where it was located, you would expect that the turnover wouldn't be in excess of, for argument's sake, 100 grand a year, because it would be purely people going on day trips from, say, Dublin to Belfast or vice versa. However, they were generating more monies through their bureau than the banks in Dundalk and in Newry, where in a month this bureau could do it in a week.
By using its powers to secretly examine the transactions of the Bureau de Change, the CAB investigation uncovered that Kieran Byrne had shifted over £60 million in less than 2 years to bank accounts across the globe. That money could not have come from the commissions paid to Byrne by day trippers changing their English pounds into Irish punts.
Accounts in banks in Eastern Europe, North and South America, Japan and South Africa were being fed from this underworld financial trading centre next door to a guard station.
When one looks at what happened up in Dramad in terms of the money that was going through that location, it was like a conduit, but very much border focused, and very much focused on those people who were involved in paramilitary activity, engaged in nefarious deeds and criminal activity up to that particular time.
The money laundering at the Bureau de Change at Dramad was a prime example where you had drug dealers, you had racketeers, you had smugglers all putting money in as part of a money laundering process. But that was done, obviously, with the clearance of the IRA.
Are you saying to me that that money laundering operation in Dramad couldn't have existed without the IRA?
Well, it wouldn't have been allowed to exist. Nothing happened along the border unless it was given clear sanction by the IRA.
Dramad was the epicenter of an international conspiracy. Law enforcement agencies in America, Europe, Asia and South Africa were alerted to the flows of hot money from this modest building. The cab was just one of the interested parties seeking to unmask the identities of the deposit holders at Dramad.
It involved agencies as far away as the DEA in America, FBI, MI5 and MI6 in London, and United Kingdom Customs, both mainland and north of Ireland, and our own customs here in this jurisdiction, to identify what kind of criminality was generating the vast amounts of monies that were circulating through this bureau.
For over a year, the cops and the spooks kept the little honeypot at Dramad under surveillance. Then, at a summit meeting in Belfast in October 1999, Felix McKenna announced that it was time to go for broke.
Everybody agreed in around September of 1999 that action needed to be taken. It involved the deployment of 400 personnel on one operation. Now, the reason why there was so many personnel involved was in the northern sector of the border, it required the British Army to fly in and secure the areas that were going to be searched by helicopter into South Armagh. In our own jurisdiction, the Irish Army had to be called in to assist and provide security to the search teams that were operating. On the day of the knock, as we say, a large number of places were searched. Kieran Bourne, who was the owner and proprietor of Dramad, his private house was searched, as was a large number of other private houses.
When armed detectives arrived to raid the Gangland bank, they found two young women working in the front office and an eerie sense of calm about the place.
The officers carrying out the search located a number of safes. They were opened and they were stuffed full with cash. They were packed tight with cash.
How much roughly is in there?
£100,000.
There's a timer safe with a 30-minute timer. Part of it, a staff member here, about 150,000.
At the rear of the office, there was a room, and the girls alerted the search operation. That's Kieran Bourne's room. That's where all the big customers are dealt with. The persons with the suitcases and the plastic bags. On searching that room, we discovered that it was a vacant lot. Everything had been cleaned out. Drawers empty, cabinets empty. There was no record, no diaries, no checkbook stubs, no checkbooks. Literally no record existed in them on the customer base. It was kind of a setback to us.
Kieran Byrne was tipped off the cab was on the way, but whoever blew the whistle was not fully familiar with the range of powers available to the Bureau. Their search warrants were not only confined to houses and offices.
You search everything when you're out searching, because you can find a box of documents or records in places where you wouldn't expect to find them. At Kieran Bourne's dwelling house, there was about 4 or 5 cars parked outside. Each and every car was searched. In the boot of his brother's car, we found all the ledgers and the records and anything that was in the office the previous day.
The ledger books revealed that there was a very large throughput of money through the banks. It showed that the bank was involved in deposit taking, which of course is totally out of character or context for a bureau de change, and had no banking license as such. In fact, a substantial amount of the ledgers were in false names, the accounts were in false names.
So this created a problem for us. And over the next weeks and months, we were able to profile and identify almost each and every player that was involved in doing business in the Bureau of Change. We saw from the records that the business activities of this Bureau de Change were in excess of 250 million over a period of 3 to 4 years, which meant there was a huge amount of hidden money and a lot of money laundering exercises carried on by the owner on behalf of the people he was representing. The vast majority of them were smugglers and generating huge profit from their activities along the border. A small number of them were Dublin-based criminals who travelled there and exchanged pounds into sterling.
It was only when cab officers sifted through the treasure seized at Dramad that the bigger picture came into focus. The €2 million worth of cash they physically confiscated from the building was just small change. The ledger book revealed that over €250 million had been washed through the Bureau de Change in less than 3 years. A list of 150 shadowy figures holding accounts under code names was also found. The man who ran the place, Kieran Byrne, knew who they all were. But would he, or could he, spill the beans and live? The cab inquiry uncovered that Kieran Byrne had indeed operated the Dramad Bank under a provisional banking licence. Byrne was just another cog in the most successful and complex crime syndicate operating in these islands, the IRA. He was a front man for a movement that was adept at using front men.
During the process of improving their image and making their message acceptable to people north and south of the border, Sinn Féin and the IRA increasingly distanced themselves from racketeering. The one thing they weren't going to allow is an activist, an ex-prisoner, a senior official in the organisation to be caught involved in one of these rackets. So in a sense, they subcontracted or give franchises out to allow other individuals to work these enterprises, and they had to pay a huge commission to the professionals.
One smuggler who paid the Provos a tariff to operate was Kieran Smith. Smith's name had turned up on the Dramad ledger books. Byrne had given him the ingenious alias of KS. It didn't take too long for Cab to figure out that KS was in fact Kieran Smith. In his day, Smith had trafficked every brand of contraband: narcotics, weapons and cigarettes for clients that included drug dealers and Republican terror gangs. In 2000, Kieran Smith became an active target for the Criminal Assets Bureau.
He was, for all intents and purposes, a recognised smuggler. His forte was smuggling of cigarettes. The subsequent investigation into the Bureau de Change in Dramad revealed that in the period of about 3 years prior to October of 1999, Kieran Smith, through his company, West Lodge Freight was the name of the company, moved 12.5 million through the Bureau de Change.
For over a year, Kieran Smith was the subject of an undercover investigation codenamed Operation Factual. The Criminal Assets Bureau pursued the money trail left by Smith across Europe. They hoped the inquiry would lead them to the loot stashed abroad by Smith and the smuggling fraternity. But before Felix McKenna could lay his hands on Smith, someone else got to him first.
He wronged the people he was working for. He sidetracked a number of container loads of cigarettes, and our information and intelligence was that he also sidetracked some monies that belonged to the main organisation that he was working for. And he suffered with his life. That was the punishment that he suffered. Months before he was due to be arrested by the police, Kieran Smith was abducted by IRA personnel from South Armagh. He was tortured and subsequently shot after a number of days. And his body was found near Ashbourne, County Meath.
Kieran Smith's post-mortem revealed that he had been severely beaten over a period of days. He'd been bound, gagged and blindfolded before being blasted twice in the back of the head with a shotgun. His body was then wrapped in a plastic bag and dumped miles from the murder scene. It was a classic IRA execution. His fate, a chilling warning to all those who crossed the godfathers of South Armagh.
When you look at the IRA, the leadership are very intelligent, very astute, very far-sighted people. They know where they want to be in 10 years' time. So what they did was through accountants, through international brokers, through estate agents, through solicitors and other expert advisors, they invested their money very wisely in buying properties all over Britain and Republic and north of Ireland, buying businesses, making those businesses appear professional and legitimate. But the fact of the matter is those businesses were established as a result of gangsterism and racketeering.
Kieran Byrne knew the secrets of how the provisional IRA washed their dirty money. He knew a lot too about where that money had been invested. But he also knew that if he cooperated with the Criminal Assets Bureau, he might end up like Kieran Smith.
At a critical stage in his dealings with the Bureau, Kieran Byrne was being cooperative, and it was indicated that he wished to make a genuine settlement of whatever his liabilities were to the best of his ability, and he was prepared to plead guilty to a certain number of the charges which he knew were coming down the road. The test for the Bureau in order to come to a settlement with him was genuinely how much money he made, and a balancing factor in this was the genuineness of the deposits in the ledgers. Most of these deposits were in false names, and it would have been important for any tax investigator to verify them by going to the deposit holders, which would have obliged Kieran Byrne to identify who the deposit holders were. The Bureau then received reliable information to the effect that if the true identity of the account holders was revealed, Kieran Byrne would suffer the ultimate penalty. We were aware that associated with this case there were some other very nasty murders and indeed in one instance a very bad torturing, and therefore the decision was made not to force Kieran Byrne to identify them.
It was decided that Kieran Byrne's life was more important than any information he possessed on the deposit holders at Dromad. Felix McKenna took the heat off Byrne and charged him with money laundering and tax offences. A reprieved Byrne was only too relieved to pay up and take the rap. In February 2002, he was jailed for 4 years for money laundering offences. And by the time he had finished his sentence, he had paid CAB a total of €3.2 million.
Within a month of the Criminal Assets Bureau shutting down Kieran Byrne's operation in Dromad, the smugglers and crime bosses moved their operation to this dilapidated little old customs post on the border between Armagh and Monaghan in a little spot called Silver Stream. Now, in the period of 2 years, using just a laptop and a fax machine, the smugglers and the godfathers laundered or cleansed an estimated €300 million. All this racketeering money is gathered together. It's put through a very elaborate financial system, as you've explained. How is it broken down? How does the Republican movement distribute that money when they get their hands on it?
The simplest way of explaining how money was invested and spent is to say every £5 collected on behalf of the organisation. During the 70s, because of the war needs of activists, £4 were assigned to them to buy guns, arms, to pay for activists on the run, to pay dependents of people who were in jail. £1 then went to Sinn Féin to carry on the business of propaganda. But during the 80s, as Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness started to take the organisation and towards a peace process, their needs obviously became greater. I would say £4 goes to Sinn Féin now and £1 is set aside for any army needs.
For quite a number of years, we looked at the Sinn Féin party organisation on the ground here in Ireland, and it was clear that a lot of money was being put into that. They had, in a great many constituencies, pretty well permanent offices. They had people put in place who were clearly going to be electoral candidates at some stage, if not in this election or the next, then in some years' time. And, you know, looking at the extent of the operation and knowing what it costs to run a political party, it was clear that there was a very substantial amount of money going through that.
The political wing never seemed to be short of cash. That had to come from somewhere. And it was accepted by the security agencies and police forces that it was, a lot of it, most of it, emanated from criminal activity. Now, if those people are involved in the same type of criminal activity, you can be sure that the Criminal Assets Bureau now has the strength and the focus and the legislation to deal with it.
CAB's investigations along the border reveal the alarming scale of Mafia-style rackets being orchestrated by both Republican terrorists and organised crime over the past 30 years. And they haven't gone away, you know.
The provosts still dictate what peace means on the border. They still dominate the landscape through fear and terror. Somehow, 21-year-old lorry driver Paul Quinn from Cullyhanna crossed the South Armagh Brigade. Quinn's family and neighbours claimed that the provisionals abducted two of his friends and forced them to lure Quinn south of the border into Monaghan. Here, 8 former or current members of the IRA smashed every bone in Paul Quinn's young body and left him for dead. Sinn Féin condemned the murder, but Paul Quinn's family say they are sure they know who bludgeoned their son to death, the Provisional IRA. They say no one around the border, no one around here, will have peace as long as the Ra runs their Republic of Fear.
Criminality in any form has no place within the ranks of the party that I represent. I would hope it's also seen.
Caoimhín Ó Caoláin is the leader of Sinn Féin in Dáil Éireann, where he has served as a TD for Cavan Monaghan since 1997. We wanted to put to Deputy Ó Caoláin the allegations that Sinn Féin is a direct beneficiary of IRA racketeering and crime. He declined to respond. This surprised us, as normally Deputy Ó Caoláin is happy to defend the honour of his organisation. Instead, we were then contacted by Sinn Féin press officer Dawn Doyle. She told us that Caoimhín was willing in principle to answer any questions, but could she meet us first and see those questions? We told her to read the book The Untouchables, upon which this series is based, and in which key players in Sinn Féin and the IRA are implicated in organised crime. Despite further reminders, we did not hear from the Sinn Féin press officer anymore.
If it emerges that any part of the activity of Sinn Féin, either here or in the administration in Northern Ireland, is being funded illegally, then the full sanction of the law should be applied. and the consequences have to be what they will be. And if the Criminal Assets Bureau can help in that, then I think it should.
We've had a very difficult process to negotiate in Ireland in the last 20 years to move Northern Ireland from where it was to where it is now, and understandably concerns were expressed about whether there was a danger that in doing all of that we would in some sense turn a blind eye in this part of Ireland to paramilitary activity. I want to assure your viewers that is not happening and has not happened. And in fact, in recent weeks, I met the head of the Bureau and he reassured me that the operations of the Bureau in relation to that matter are without fear or favour. And indeed, in all matters, there are no special ins for people in this area. If people are involved in crime and they have assets as a result, we target them.
In March 2006, the Criminal Assets Bureau, along with their counterparts in the United Kingdom, swooped on Thomas Slab Murphy, the godfather of bandit country. During a series of searches along the border, the security forces unearthed extensive evidence of a hidden economy worth hundreds of millions of euro. Sinn Féin leader Gerry Adams protested at the searches and remarked that Slab Murphy was somehow important to the peace process.
I want to deal with what is an effort to portray Tom Murphy as a criminal, as a bandit, as a gang boss, as a multi-millionaire. There is no evidence to support any of that. Tom Murphy is not a criminal. He's a good Republican. He's also, and very importantly, a key supporter of the Sinn Féin peace strategy and has been for a very long time.
But the Criminal Assets Bureau ignored Adams, and in May 2006, Murphy was served with a demand for €5 million. Then last November, as he left the GAA match in Dundalk, the Republican movement's most elusive godfather was arrested by armed detectives and bundled into the back of a squad car. He was later charged by CAB for a variety of tax offences and is due to appear before the non-jury Special Criminal Court to explain his apparent failure to make tax returns for 12 years. It now appears that no one is untouchable. For years, the Provisional IRA have cooperated with international terror gangs. Republicans have conspired with outfits like ETA in Spain and the FARC narco-terrorists in Colombia, who are funded solely through the production of cocaine. Weapons, expertise, funds and narcotics have all been exchanged in gestures of revolutionary solidarity.
If anything that Gerry Adams has just said about his concern about drugs is true, it's given the total lie that when he was a member of the Army Council of the IRA, he sent a team of people to exchange Provo know-how in making mortars for $25 million from narco-terrorists who made all of that money selling cocaine.
In the post-9/11 era, we've come to appreciate how terror has gone global. And what holds for subversives also holds true for organised crime. The major players in Ireland, the John Gilligans, the George Mitchells and the Dutchy Hollands, have all forged links with overseas crime cartels and dispersed their dirty money abroad. To keep up, law enforcement agencies like the Criminal Assets Bureau are also globalising.
Society is continuously changing. The face of the criminal world is continuously changing. And one of the things that I'm finding in the Criminal Assets Bureau is that criminals from various European countries are working closely with the criminals from Ireland in relation to the illegal drug trade, in relation to smuggling. The criminals are still making considerable profits. They have become more sophisticated and more adept at hiding those assets. This has meant that we have to become more sophisticated and adept at following those assets and tracing them.
The challenge comes when we have to find those assets that are located abroad, overseas, outside of an investigator's normal jurisdictional area. And the challenge is for law enforcement, first of all, is to be able to identify when there are new possibilities to conceal and invest criminal profit. For example, Spain is very common to buy the luxury villa in Marbella. The challenge to law enforcement and to agencies like CAB is to be aware of those possibilities.
A lot of the criminals and the assets that we're now dealing with, these people were 10, 11 years of age when the Criminal Assets Bureau started. They have grown up with the concept of the Criminal Assets Bureau. They're very conscious when they set out on their criminal enterprises as to how to hide and secrete the proceeds of their criminality.
They'll go to any lengths that they can to get what they want at the end of the day, which of course is again all about the money. They're parasites. These people are a threat to our day-to-day way of life.
This is the playground of the rich, famous and infamous. Gangsters have been part of the landscape here ever since English villains first discovered the south of Spain in the 1960s. In fact, the Costa del Sol was so popular with the underworld that it was dubbed the Costa del Crime, the little bit of Spain that fell off the back of a truck.
The Costa del Sol is now the hub for European organised crime, and Irish gangsters are major players here. Some, like John Gilligan, have a steady stream of income from their property portfolios. Others, like the Westie leaders Shane Coates and Stephen Sugg, have found that these waters can be treacherous. Just recently, hitman Paddy Doyle also got in over his head with more lethal international gangsters and also ended up dead. But that's not putting off a new, young, ruthless breed of criminal, greedy for the dirty money that can be soaked up in the sun.
The crime lords are becoming younger and younger. They are coming on the street in their local communities, getting rich fast and not afraid to show the trappings of their wealth.
The individuals who manage these wholesale gangs are getting younger and younger and more carefree about human life and the maintenance of their empire. Clearly, CAB have a huge role to play in confronting these individuals in their financial networks before they're even brought to the courts.
The perception out there is that these people are actually getting away with it and that they can do what they like. My attitude is that there is no asset that is too small if it is the proceeds of crime. There's no asset that's too small to actually take.
It's very important we continue to challenge them, not just the big, notorious cases, but the smaller operatives who bring so much misery to individual communities through the drugs trade, through other criminal activities. They have to be targeted. That's the job of the CAB.
It's over 10 years since the double murders of Jerry McCabe and Veronica Guerin traumatised the Irish people and prompted the state to set up the Criminal Assets Bureau. During that time, CAB has waged a war against organised crime and terror gangs. The Bureau has hit the gangsters where it really hurts, their pockets and their possessions. And what was originally an Irish solution to an Irish problem has now become the model for crime fighters worldwide.
The day will come, and that day will come soon, when countries, certainly within the European Union, will come together and decide that those who believe that they are untouchable now because they cannot be touched at home will be touchable everywhere.
You sort of sit back 10 years later and look at it and say, yeah, I was part of that team. Nobody's ever responsible for something uniquely on their own. But I do feel that if Nora Owen and myself had not been there at that point in time, following the murder of Garda Jerry McCabe and Veronica Guerin, the CAB would not have come into existence. And of that, I'm very proud.
When I read in the newspapers that somebody was prosecuted arising out of the work of the Criminal Assets Bureau, I do have a little smile and I say, well, there you are. I was there when it was started and I feel very proud of that.
Scary to think about it, but if you didn't have the Criminal Assets Bureau, I think things would be infinitely worse. It would have been extremely difficult to control and to contend with organised crime without an agency that can target their resources.
You know your mission. Your mission is going to be very simple. Focus on the assets and profits of organised crime and attack the profits of organised crime. Therefore, create an air of decapitation of the underworld.
My most abiding memory of the Bureau is the support and enthusiasm of all of the Bureau officers. It was just unreserved application of their very best efforts, and that's what made the Bureau work. No hang-ups, no demarcation, no posing, no glory getting. Just do it.
The Criminal Assets Bureau has earned its plaudits throughout the world. It has hit crime bosses, terrorists, and corrupt public figures hard. To date, it has seized or frozen property and cash worth in excess of €200 million. But organised crime continues to prosper, and that means there's a lot more dirty money out there for the taking.
So make sure to join us here on 3 next Monday. Paul Williams will be back for more Dirty Money. Stay with us tonight, though, for an in-depth look at today's big news stories. TV3 Nightly News with Vincent Brown is after the break.